It started like any other quiet morning at the lake. The water was calm, the air was still, and the sun was barely peeking over the trees. I had my coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the peaceful view I had grown to love. But something was off. The smell hit me first, sharp, bitter, and completely out of place. At first, I thought maybe it was just something natural, like algae. But within days, it got worse. I walked closer to the shore and noticed the water didn't look right. It was murkier than usual, almost like something was clouding it up. There was a strange film floating on the surface in places, and dead fish began to appear along the edge. Not just one or two, dozens. The smell, the look, the dead wildlife, something was seriously wrong. I wasn't about to let it slide. I started talking to neighbors. Some had noticed it too, but most brushed it off. It's just seasonal, they'd say. It's probably nothing. But I knew better. I had lived near this lake for years, and this wasn't normal. I decided to start digging, just to see if I could figure out what had changed. I filed a small report with the local environmental department. They took a sample and said it would take time to get results. While waiting, I started watching patterns, especially how often the HOA's maintenance trucks were coming and going. There was a patch of land just a short walk from my property line, tucked behind some trees, near one of the HOA's service areas. I had never paid much attention to it before. But that's when I noticed it. A pipe. Half buried. Leading straight toward the lake. At first glance, it looked abandoned, maybe part of an old irrigation system. But then I heard it. A low gurgling, faint but steady. I followed the line and traced it back to what looked like a runoff valve, hidden near one of the HOA's utility sheds. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. I snapped some pictures. Recorded some videos. Every couple of days, I returned to document changes. And every time, the smell got stronger and the lake looked worse. By the time the environmental test results came back, I already had my suspicions. But when they confirmed high levels of bacteria and human waste, I was sick to my stomach. This wasn't just an accident. Someone was dumping sewage, and it wasn't hard to guess who. I reached out to the HOA. Politely at first. Sent an email, even included the test results and a few pictures. I figured maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they didn't know. No reply. A week passed. I followed up. Still nothing. So I called. Got put on hold, transferred, and eventually told that someone would look into it. But they didn't. Or maybe they did, and just hoped I'd go away. But I wasn't going anywhere. This was my lake. My property backed right onto it. I'd fished there. I'd swum there. My family had barbecues by the water every summer. This wasn't just a puddle in the woods, it was home. So I filed another complaint, this time with more detail. I also started talking to other homeowners, asking if they had any strange experiences with the HOA's plumbing or runoff. A few had seen unusual truck activity near the same site I had been watching. One neighbor said their water pressure had dropped unexpectedly a few times over the last year. Another told me about hearing pumps running in the middle of the night. Every piece started coming together. It wasn't just sewage runoff, it looked like the HOA had set up some kind of unofficial dumping system. And worse, they were doing it on land that didn't even belong to them. That lake wasn't public. It wasn't managed by the HOA. It was mine. I owned it. And apparently, they had no idea. While they were secretly draining waste into my water, I was sitting on something they needed a whole lot more than I ever realized. They thought they were being clever. But what they didn't know was going to cost them more than they could imagine. I wasn't angry at first. Just shocked. You'd think an HOA would have more sense than to secretly dump waste into someone else's private lake. But as I pieced together the truth, that shock started turning into something else. Not just frustration, but a real need for answers. Because I wasn't dealing with a simple mistake. This felt deliberate. Calculated. And they were hoping I'd never figure it out. I went back over the property records. Double-checked every line, every map, every deed. I owned the lake outright. The shoreline, the water itself, everything. Years ago, I bought the land with the intention of keeping it preserved. I'd even turned down offers from developers who wanted to build docks and rental cabins. The whole point of owning it was to keep it clean, peaceful, untouched. And now this. So I started asking more questions. Not just to the HOA, but to the city, the county, and the environmental agency. I wanted to know who approved what. Were there permits? Did anyone sign off on this kind of discharge? The answers came slowly, but they were consistent. No one had approved any dumping. In fact, if what I was saying was true, the HOA could be facing serious fines, even lawsuits. I thought, maybe I'll give them one last chance. One last moment to come clean. So I showed up to the next HOA meeting. Not to start a fight, but to present what I had found. I brought the photos, the videos, the test results. I laid everything out in front of the board, calmly. No yelling. No threats. Just facts. You could hear a pin drop when I said the words, "This is my lake. And you've been dumping sewage into it." At first, they looked confused. A few even laughed, like I was exaggerating. But as I pulled out the property maps and pointed to the pipe's exact location, the mood shifted fast. One of the board members leaned over and whispered something to another. I could see the panic starting to flicker behind their eyes. They knew. But instead of apologizing, or even admitting it, they tried to turn it back on me. Said the pipe might have been from an older system that was there before they took over. Suggested I should have been maintaining the area better, even though it wasn't theirs to manage. One board member actually had the nerve to say, "Well, maybe if you hadn't kept the land so private, this wouldn't have happened." That's when I knew this wasn't going to be solved with a conversation. After the meeting, I stayed behind and spoke to a few residents. Some were stunned. Others weren't surprised at all. A couple of longtime homeowners told me the HOA had pulled shady moves before, rezoning green space, rerouting storm drains, even mismanaging funds. But nobody had been able to stop them. Until now. Over the next few days, I made a list. A list of everything I needed to do, every step to hold them accountable. First, I contacted an environmental attorney. Someone who specialized in water rights and property law. I shared all my findings and handed over the documentation. The attorney's reaction said it all, this wasn't just a civil matter. It bordered on criminal. Then I had another realization. The HOA had been getting their water supply for irrigation, maintenance, maybe even some of the common area facilities from the same source they'd been polluting. My lake. That quiet little body of water they treated like a dumping ground was the same one they were depending on to keep their community looking clean and pristine. They'd been poisoning their own lifeline. It was a strange feeling. A mix of rage and amusement. All that arrogance, all that control they liked to wave around, and they didn't even bother to check who actually owned the resource they were abusing. They thought they were above the rules. That no one would challenge them. So I made a decision. I wasn't just going to clean up the lake. I was going to make sure they never had the chance to touch it again. And I was going to do it the right way, legally, thoroughly, and in a way that would hit them exactly where it hurt most. Because if they didn't respect the land or the water, they sure as hell were going to respect the person who owned it. I didn't waste any more time after that meeting. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how deep this went. It wasn't just a pipe and some sewage. It was a pattern of negligence, covered in fake smiles and monthly newsletters. The HOA had been operating like their own little kingdom, making decisions without approval, bending the rules whenever it suited them. But now they'd messed with the wrong person. I filed a formal complaint with the state's Environmental Protection Agency. Sent over all my evidence, photos, videos, maps, water test results. The response came quicker than I expected. Within a week, a state inspector was out at the lake with me. We walked the shoreline together. He took samples, took pictures, took notes. I didn't have to convince him, he saw what I saw. The pipe, the sludge, the cloudy water, the foul smell. It was all undeniable. He looked over at me and said, "This isn't just wrong. This is illegal." That same day, I got a call from the county office. Apparently, word was already spreading. Officials wanted to meet. They were curious why an HOA would be discharging waste onto private property without permits, without notice, without anything. The meeting wasn't even about proving guilt anymore. It was about how bad the violation was, and how far it had gone before someone blew the whistle. And here's the part that really surprised me. Once I started making noise, people started talking. I got messages from other property owners, emails, even a few anonymous tips. One person sent me internal documents they claimed were from the HOA, old maintenance logs and budgets that hinted at a grey water drainage system installed quietly, years ago. Another neighbor told me he saw the HOA pump trucks coming out late at night during the summer, parking near that pipe, staying there for hours. It was no longer just my word against theirs. The truth was coming out in layers, and each one made them look worse. But I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was also preparing something else, something I knew would catch them completely off guard. Remember, I owned the lake. But what they didn't realize was, I also held the water rights tied to the lake's natural source, an underground spring system that fed into several nearby ponds and, more importantly, supplied a portion of the HOA's irrigation and landscape water through an old, shared water district agreement. They thought they were dealing with a guy who just liked fishing. They didn't realize they were dumping sewage into their own supply chain. So I reached out to the water district. Had a long conversation about the situation. I explained what was going on, what I had discovered, and why the agreement might need to be re-examined. Turns out, that agreement hadn't been updated in over a decade. And guess what? It was set to expire in a few months unless both parties agreed to renew it. That's when it hit me. I didn't have to sue them to make an impact. I didn't have to fight them in court for years. All I had to do was say no. No to the renewal. No to the water rights. No to giving them access to my lake or the springs that fed it. They had taken it all for granted. Assumed they were entitled. Assumed no one would stand up to them. Now, they were about to find out just how much damage one angry landowner with all the legal leverage could do. Of course, I didn't go public with that plan immediately. I let the investigations continue. Let the officials do their jobs. But behind the scenes, I started documenting every single water use violation, every unauthorized connection, every inch of pipe that crossed into my land. I even hired a surveyor to map the underground lines that ran from the lake to the HOA's green spaces. And when the HOA finally sent a letter asking to revisit our shared water rights agreement, I smiled. They had no idea what was coming. All they saw was a quiet lake. All I saw was a ticking clock and a community that was about to learn what happens when you disrespect the wrong neighbor. The letter they sent me was so carefully worded, it was almost funny. Full of "we'd love to collaborate and we value our relationship with local landowners." They didn't say sorry. Not once. They didn't mention the pipe. Didn't mention the sewage. Just a generic message asking to reconsider terms of the water rights agreement. I could practically hear the panic behind the paper. By then, the environmental investigation was already underway. I had people from 3 different agencies walking my land, testing water, taking measurements. One inspector even told me off the record that they had rarely seen an HOA so careless with natural resources. There were talks of hefty fines, penalties, maybe even a criminal investigation. And all I had to do was stay out of the way and let the process move forward. But I wasn't done yet. While they were scrambling to figure out how to fix their mess, I was preparing the final piece of my plan. It started with the old survey maps. I had those re-evaluated by a professional land surveyor, someone certified and experienced with property boundaries and easements. What he found just made everything worse for them. Turns out, the HOA had more than just a pipe on my land. Several of their walking trails and utility lines crossed into my property by as much as 30 feet in some areas. One of their tool sheds, the one near the pipe, was partially built over the property line. That meant they weren't just using my lake illegally, they were physically trespassing. I had the surveyor mark everything clearly. Flags. Stakes. Full report. I also hired a lawyer to prepare a cease and desist order, which I planned to send directly to the HOA board. It wasn't just about getting back at them. It was about setting the record straight. They needed to know that private property means something. And when you treat someone's land like a dump, there are consequences. Around that same time, residents in the community started to catch wind of what was happening. I wasn't the one spreading it. But the news had a way of moving through the neighborhood like wildfire. People started showing up at HOA meetings demanding answers. Is it true we've been using polluted water? Why did you dump into a private lake? What's this about losing our irrigation supply? The board was clearly caught off guard. They tried damage control, blaming miscommunication, saying the pipe was from a past vendor who was no longer under contract. But residents weren't buying it. And neither was the state. One afternoon, I got a call from the local news. Someone had tipped them off. I debated whether to say anything. I didn't want attention. But I did want the truth out there. So I agreed to talk anonymously. I explained the facts, gave them the reports and photos, and let them tell the story. The segment aired later that week, and the fallout was immediate. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Then came the real kicker: they tried to negotiate. A formal letter this time, offering to make things right. They were willing to discuss compensation, willing to assist with cleanup, and open to renegotiating water access under new terms. They even offered to install a new irrigation system, one that didn't involve my lake at all. But by then, it was too late. I didn't want money. I didn't want their help. I wanted them out. I wanted them to realize that not everything could be controlled with a rulebook and a smug attitude. They had spent years acting like the neighborhood was theirs to run however they liked. Now they were realizing they didn't even know who they were messing with. And the thing is, I still hadn't played my final card. They knew about the water rights. They knew they'd lose access. But what they didn't know, not yet, anyway, was that I had been talking to a buyer. A very big buyer. A company interested in natural water sources. Clean lakes. Large parcels of land. The kind of company that doesn't flinch at seven-figure offers. The same lake they treated like a trash can. Someone else saw it as a priceless resource. So while they were busy sending apology letters and trying to cover their tracks, I was in the middle of a quiet negotiation. One that would not only make sure they never touched my water again, but also made sure the future of that lake would be in hands that actually respected it. And as for the HOA, they were about to find out how expensive disrespect can get. The offer came in on a Friday. A thick envelope, hand-delivered by a courier, with the company's logo printed in clean, bold letters. Inside was a proposal that nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far beyond what I expected. They weren't just interested in buying the lake. They wanted the entire surrounding acreage. The wooded land, the spring source, the buffer zones I had kept untouched for years. And they weren't offering millions. They were offering *billions*. I read it twice. Then 3 more times. Every line. Every condition. They weren't looking to develop the land in the traditional sense. They were an eco-resource company, focused on clean water preservation and carbon offset projects. They wanted to protect the lake. Restore it. Use it as a model for long-term water conservation, the kind of thing that would make headlines, boost shareholder value, and make their brand look like heroes. It was perfect. For me. For the land. And most of all, for getting the HOA out of my life for good. Still, I wasn't ready to jump in blindly. I asked for a meeting. We met at a quiet cafe outside of town. Their rep was sharp. Professional. Knew the property line details better than some of the local agencies. And the first thing she said to me was, "We know about the HOA problem. We'll make sure they never set foot near your lake again." That was the moment I knew this deal wasn't just good. It was surgical. They already had legal teams reviewing easement maps and water access agreements. They knew what pipes crossed what land. They knew the HOA had been illegally tapping into a resource they didn't own. And they weren't just going to cut them off, they were planning to file claims for environmental damage once the sale went through. I didn't even have to do it myself. But I had one request. One simple clause I wanted added to the final contract, that the HOA be legally prohibited from using, accessing, or entering the lake or any of its connected land indefinitely, not just during restoration, not just until the system was replaced *forever star. The company agreed without hesitation. While the paperwork was moving forward, the HOA was busy sending out community bulletins. They were spinning the story in every way they could. Blaming historic infrastructure for the issue. Blaming contractors. Blaming confusion over boundary lines. But it didn't matter anymore. The residents had seen enough. And the city. They were preparing to slap the HOA with the largest environmental fine in the county's history. Word finally got to the board that a sale was in progress. Not just any sale, the sale. The one that meant they would lose access to the water they had quietly depended on for years. That's when the real desperation started. They sent another letter. This one wasn't polite. It was full of legal threats, demands, accusations that I was trying to sabotage the neighborhood. They tried to argue that by selling, I was hurting property values. That I was being vindictive. I had my lawyer respond with a single sentence: "My client is exercising his full legal right to sell his private property, a property you have knowingly abused for years." That shut them up. Publicly, anyway. Privately, they tried again. This time, it wasn't from the board. It was from individual members. One even came to my gate, unannounced, with a coffee and a fake smile, talking about how we were all neighbors and maybe we could come to some understanding. I didn't open the gate. Just watched him talk to the camera through the intercom. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The documents were already signed. The lake, the springs, the surrounding land, it was all days away from officially changing hands. And then it happened. The transfer finalized. The new owners installed security fencing. Posted signs. Issued cease and desist orders to the HOA. Surveyors came in. Utility access was shut off. The HOA's landscapers showed up the next morning and realized they couldn't water half the common areas anymore. Panic spread. Residents were furious. And the board had no answers. Their secret pipeline was gone. Their access revoked. And their reputation? Sinking faster than their excuses. All because they dumped sewage into the wrong lake. And the man who owned it? He had just made the biggest deal of his life while making sure they paid the price for every single gallon. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to hit. Within a week of the sale closing, every sprinkler system in the HOA-controlled common areas sputtered and stopped. The grass turned brown almost overnight. The flower beds wilted. The decorative fountains ran dry. And just like that, the image they'd built, the pristine, over-manicured lawns they used to show off their neighborhood superiority, started to fall apart. I watched from my back porch as trucks came and went, carrying hoses, trying to find alternate water sources. They even attempted to tap into the city line, but permits take time, and money, and inspections. And time wasn't something they had anymore. Every day the lawns dried out, more residents showed up at board meetings with red faces and louder voices. Some of those residents had voted for this board. Some had believed the HOA's version of the story. Now they were realizing they'd been left in the dark, literally and figuratively. The news had a field day with it. Follow-up stories hit the local paper. Lake owner sells to water corporation after HOA dumps waste. Headlines like that don't disappear quickly. Reporters dug deeper, uncovering emails between HOA members that hinted at long-term knowledge of the illegal pipe. There was even talk of a whistleblower, someone from inside the HOA office who'd quietly handed over logs showing exactly when the sewage discharge began. And how many times they'd ignored warnings. But none of it surprised me. What did surprise me was how quickly the residents turned on the board. Within 2 weeks, petitions started circulating. People demanded resignations. Emergency elections were called. One by one, board members began stepping down, citing stress, personal reasons, and legal distractions. A new board took their place, younger, more transparent, more aware of the mess they'd inherited. One of them even reached out to me directly. Not with an apology, not yet, but with a question: is there anything we can do to fix this? It was a good question. But I wasn't in a rush to answer. Meanwhile, the company that had bought the lake wasted no time. They had environmental crews on site daily. Hazmat suits. Testing kits. Boats collecting samples. They were restoring the shoreline, purifying the spring source, and documenting every bit of damage done. One of the project managers told me they were preparing to file claims for cleanup costs and they intended to make the HOA responsible. And here's where it got even better. Turns out the old water usage agreement between my land and the HOA had specific breach terms. Legal terms. And those terms allowed the holder of the water rights, now the corporation, to pursue damages if the water was ever misused or contaminated. The HOA hadn't just lost access. They had opened themselves up to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. But the fallout didn't stop there. Real estate agents started pulling listings. Properties in the neighborhood began dropping in value. Nobody wanted to buy into a community surrounded by lawsuits and dead landscaping. No one wanted to pay premium dues for a crumbling reputation. Even the residents who had nothing to do with the board's decisions were now stuck in the storm. And they were angry. Some started calling lawyers. I heard rumors that a class action suit was forming, residents suing the HOA board for mismanagement and loss of property value. Others just packed up and left. I saw moving trucks. For sale signs. One house down the street sold for nearly 40% below its original listing price. The place had once been considered exclusive. Now, it was practically a cautionary tale. But through all of this, I didn't say much. I didn't gloat. Didn't post about it. I just let it unfold. Quietly. Steadily. I kept walking the edge of the lake, which was starting to look clearer every day. The birds were back. The fish were returning. And for the first time in a while, the land felt calm again. Like it was healing. And as for the HOA, they still hadn't grasped the full weight of what they'd done. The legal bills were just beginning. The lawsuits hadn't even landed yet. They had played with fire, thinking no one would notice, or that no one could push back. They thought they could act in secret forever. But now, their secrets were out. And the price was far more than they ever expected to pay.